Chapter 6. Every year in Easter week, Simon Anderson held an ale feast for the folk from all the parish. They came to Formoe the third day after the Mass, and stayed there till Thursday. Kristin had never had much delight in these feastings. When mirth and merrymaking were afoot, both Simon and Ramborg seemed to think the more bustle and uproar there was at the feast, the better it was. Simon always prayed the guests to bring their own children and their serving folk with their children, as many as might be away from home. The first day things went quietly and peacefully. The great folk and the elders led the talk, while the youth listened and ate and drank, and the small children were for the most in another house. But on the second day the host went about from early morning and egged on the young and unstayed folk and children to drink and make merry. And it was not long then, for the most part, till the mirth grew so wild and wanton that wives and young maids shrank into the corners and stood there in groups tittering, ready to run out, while many of the most worshipful housewives gathered in Ramborg's ladies' house, where already the mothers had carried off the smaller children out of the hurly-burly in the great hall. But this year Easter had brought wondrous fair spring weather. On the Wednesday, from early morn, it was so warm and sunny that, the morning meal scarce over, all the company swarmed out into the courtyard. Instead of racketing and raising riot, the young folks were soon busy playing ball, shooting at a mark or hauling on the rope. Then began the game of stag and dancing on the log. After that they got Geirmund of Crook to pluck his harp and sing, and thereon both young and old were soon footing it in the dance. The snow still lay low on the fields, but the alder woods were brown with blossoms, and the sun shone warm and fair on every bare hillside. When folks came out after the supper, there was such singing of birds everywhere, and they built a bonfire on the field beyond the smithy and sang and danced till far into the night. Next morning the guests lay long in bed, and thus they broke up and took their leave later than was their use. The folk from Jorengard were wont to be the last to leave, and now Simon prevailed on Erland and Kristin to tarry over the next day. The Crook folk were to stay the week out at Formoe. Simon had gone up to the highway with the last flock of guests. The evening sun shone so fair over his lands, lying spread out on the hill slopes. He was warm and of good cheer with the drink and all the junketing, and as he went down between the fences, home to the quiet and easy fellowship that follows when, after a great banquet, a little ring of near kinsfolk are left together, he felt himself gladder and more light of heart than he had been for a long time. Down on the fields by the smithy they had set the bonfire a-going again. Erland's sons, Sigrid's eldest children, John Dork's sons, and his own daughters. Simon hung over the fence a while, watching them. Ulfhild's holy day frock flared scarlet in the sun. She ran about dragging branches to the fire, and there she lay, her length on the ground. Her father shouted to them, laughing, but they did not hear. In the courtyard sat two wenches minding the smallest children. They sat close by the bower wall, sunning themselves. Over their heads the evening light burned like melted gold upon the small glass pane. Simon took little Inga Geirmundsdatter, heaved her high into the air, and set her upon his arm. "Can you sing today for your uncle, Inga?" And at that her brother and Andres set upon him, and would be thrown high in the air as well. Whistling, he climbed the stairway to the upper hall. The sun shone in so bravely. They had opened the door wide. The folk within sat in goodly quiet. Up at the end of the board, Erland and Geirmund were bent over the harp, putting new strings to it. They had the mead horn beside them on the board. Sigrid lay upon the bed, giving her youngest son the breast. Kristin and Ramborg sat by her. A silver mug stood on the footboard between the sisters. Simon filled his own gilded beaker with wine, went to the bed, and drank to Sigrid. "Everyone here has the wherewithal to slake their thirsts, I see, except you, my sister." Laughing, she raised herself on her elbow and took the beaker. The little child, disquieted at his meal, burst into an angry howl. Simon sat down on the bench, still whistling softly and hearkening to the others with half an ear. Sigrid and Kristin gossiped of their children. Ramborg sat silent, toying with a little windmill of Andres. The men by the board fingered the harp strings to try them. Erland sang a stave very softly. Geirmund picked out the air on the harp and sang the verse after him. They both had such tuneful voices. A little after, Simon went out onto the balcony, stood leaning against the carven pillar, and gazed around. From the byre came the everlasting hungry bellowing. If this weather would but hold a while, maybe the string dearth would not last so long this year. It was Kristin who came. He didn't need to turn. He knew her light tread. She stepped out and stood by his side in the evening sunlight. So fair and fine that she had never seemed to him so fair. And all at once he felt as though, in some way, he were lifted up, as though he floated in this sunlight. He drew a long breath. Suddenly it came upon him. It was good to live. A rich and golden happiness flooded all his being. She was his own sweet love. All the heavy bitter thoughts he had thought were but as half-forgotten follies. Poor, poor love of mine, could I but do you anything of good? Could you but be glad once more, gladly would I lay down my life, if that might help you. He saw well that her lovesome face was worn and aged. Fine small wrinkles had gathered beneath her eyes. Her skin had lost its pure shine. It had grown coarser and sunburned, and she was pale beneath the brown. But to him for sure she would always be fair. For her great grey eyes, and her fine still mouth, and her little round chin, her restful tempered bearing too, were the fairest things he knew on earth. And it was good too once more to see her clad as befitted a high-born lady. The thin little silken kerchief but half hid the masses of her yellow-brown hair. The plaits were caught up so that they peeped forth above her ears. There were streaks of grey in her hair now, but it was no matter. And she bore a stately blue outer robe of velvet edged with ermine. It was cut so deeply at the bosom, and the arm slits were so long, that over breast and shoulders it showed no more than the breast straps of a horse's gear. It was brave to look on. Underneath there clung a somewhat yellow as sand, an underrobe that lay smooth to the body, stood high around her throat, and ran down to the wrists. It was buttoned with many small gilded buttons, and they touched him to the heart. God forgive him. All these little gilt buttons gladdened him like the sight of a troop of angels. He stood feeling his own heart's strong, quiet beat. Something had slipped from him. Aye, like chains. Evil, hateful dreams. They were but shadows of the night. And now he saw his love for her by light of day, in full sunshine. You look at me strangely, Simon. Why are you smiling like that? The man laughed low and joyously, but did not answer. Out before them lay the dale, filled with the evening sun's golden glow. Flocks of birds twittered and chirruped shrilly in the borders of the woods. Then from somewhere deep in the forest a thrush's full clear song ran out. And here she stood, warmed by the sun, shining in her festal pride, escaped from out the dark, cold house and the coarse, heavy garments reeking of sweat and toil. Kristin mine, it was good to see you thus again. He took her hand that lay before him on the railing, lifted it up toward his face. This ring you bear upon your finger is a fair one. He turned the finger ring a little and laid her hand down again. The hand was chafed and reddened now, and he didn't know how he could ever do enough to make amends for it. So fair had it been, her long, slender hand. "'Tis Arnyerd and Gout," said Kristin. "Those two are quarrelling again." From below the loft balcony came the voices, high and angry. Now the maid broke in with a cry of rage. I remember that. I think it's more honour to be called a bastard daughter to my father than to be a true-born son of yours." Kristin turned sharp about and ran down the stairway. Simon, following after, heard the sound of 2 or 3 buffets on her cheek. He saw her standing under the balcony, holding her son by the shoulder. The 2 children stood looking down, red-faced, silent and sullen. "I see well you know how to behave to your hosts," Kristin said. "You do us honour, forsooth, your father and me." Gout gazed down on the ground. Low and angrily he answered his mother. "She said something. I will not say it again." Simon took his daughter by the chin, forced her to look up at him. Arnyerd grew redder and dropped her eyelids under her father's look. "Yes," she broke away from him. I reminded Gout that his father was judged a villain and a traitor to his king. But first he had called you, father. You, he said, were the traitor, and you had Erland to thank that you sat here rich and scatheless on your own manor. I had thought you were a grown maid now. Would you be egged on by a child's chatter to forget both manners and the dues of kin?" He pushed the girl from him angrily, turned to Gout and asked most soberly, "What do you mean, friend Gout, that I have betrayed your father? I have felt before this you were angry with me. Now you have to say what the cause may be." "That you know well." Simon shook his head. And then the boy cried out, flaming with fury. "The letter they broke my father on the rack for, to make him tell who hung their seals below it. I saw it. It was I who went off with it and burnt it." "Be still!" Erland burst in among them. His face was white to the very lips. His eyes burned. "Erland, 'twere best now we came at the truth of this," said Simon. "Was my name in that letter?" "Be still." In furious rage his father seized Gout by the breast and shoulder. "I trusted you. You, my son. If I killed you now, you would deserve it." Kristin sprang forward. Simon too. The boy broke loose and clung to his mother. Quite beside himself with passion, he shouted at furious speed while he hid himself behind the woman's arm. "I looked on the seals before I burnt it, father. I thought the day might come when I could serve you thereby." "Damn you!" There broke from Erland's frame a short, dry sob. Simon too had grown pale, and then flushed dark red with shame for the other. He dared not look towards where Erland stood. The sight of the man's humiliation seemed to choke him. Kristin stood as though spellbound, still with her arms about her son to guard him. But within her brain thought fitted into thought with lightning speed. Erland had had Simon's privy seal for a short time that spring. The brothers-in-law were selling Lavransdatters warehouse on Vioi to the Holm Cloister brothers. Erland had said himself that it might well be this was unlawful, but it was like no one would question it. He had shown her the seal, and said that Simon might well have got him one more fairly graven. All three brothers has had their seals graven with their father's arms, only the legends were different. Gerd's was graven much finer, said Erland. Gerd da. Erland had brought her greetings from him, both the last times he came from the south country. She remembered she had marvelled that Erland should visit Gerd at Differen. They had seen each other but the once at Ramborg's wedding. Ulf Saxerson was Gerd da's brother-in-law. Ulf had been in the plot. "You saw wrong, Gout," said Simon, low and firmly. "Simon!" Blindly Kristin grasped her husband's hand. "Remember, there are other men besides you who bear that device on their seal." "Be still! Would you too?" Erland tore himself from his wife with a tortured cry and rushed across the courtyard towards the stable. Simon sprang after him. "Erland, was it my brother?" "Send for the lads. You come after me," Erland cried back to his wife. Simon caught him up again in the stable door, seized him by the arm. "Erland, was it Gerd?" Erland didn't answer. He tried to wrench himself free. His face was set and drawn and white as death. "Erland, answer me. Was my brother with you in the plot? Perhaps you want to measure swords with me too." Erland snarled out the words, and Simon, as they wrestled, felt the other's whole body tremble. "You know I will not." Simon loosed his hold and staggered backwards against the door jamb. "Erland, for the love of God that died for us, say if it was so." Erland led Soten out, forcing Simon aside from the doorway. A housecarl brought saddle and bridle. Simon took them and sent the man away. Erland took them from Simon. "Erland, surely you can tell it to me now, to me." He didn't know why he should beg thus, as though he were begging for his life. "Erland, answer me. By Christ's wounds, I ask you, tell me, man." "You can go on thinking what you thought," said Erland in a low, biting voice. "Erland, I have thought nothing." "I know what you thought." Erland swung himself into the saddle. Simon caught the horse by the headstall. It reared and flung about wildly. "Let go, or I will ride you down," said Erland. "Then I will ask Gerd. No later than tomorrow I will ride south. By God, Erland, you shall tell me." "Ah, yes, you will get an answer from him, I don't doubt it," said Erland scornfully. He spurred the stallion, and Simon had to leap aside. The other galloped from the manor. Halfway up the courtyard, Simon met Kristin. She had her cloak on. Gout walked by her side, carrying the wallet with their clothes. Ramborg was with her sister. The boy glanced up an instant, fearful and at a loss. Then he looked away. But Kristin fixed her great eyes full upon him. They were dark with sorrow and anger. "Did you believe this thing of Erland? That he could betray you so?" "I believed nothing," said Simon hotly. "I believed 'twas foolish talk of that young scamp there." "No, Simon, I will not have you go with me," said Kristin low. He saw that she was unspeakably hurt and sorrowful. In the evening, when he was left alone with his wife in the great hall, they were putting off their clothes and their daughters were asleep already in the other bed. All at once Ramborg asked, "Did you know anything of this, Simon?" "No. Did you?" he asked anxiously. Ramborg came across and stood just within the light of the taper on the board. She was half undressed, in shift and laced bodice. Her hair hung loose in tresses about her face. "New? I had my thoughts. Helga was so strange." Her face twisted into a kind of smile, and she looked as though she were cold. She spoke of how now there would be other times in Norway, the great nobles. Ramborg smiled a wry, fluttering smile. They were to come to their rights here, as in other lands. Knights and barons, they would be called once more. Afterward, when I saw you take up their cause so hotly, you were from home almost all the year. You could not find time to come north to me at Ringheim when I was to bear your child in the strange man's house. Afterwards I thought perhaps you knew that there was question of others than Erland. Oh, knights and barons! Simon laughed short and angrily. Was it for Kristin's sake alone that you did it? He saw her face was pale, as it were bit with frost. It was impossible to pretend he did not understand her meaning. Desperately and defiantly he burst out, "Yes." Then he thought, why, she was mad and he was mad. Erland was mad. All the world was mad that day. But now there must be an end of it. "I did it for your sister's sake. Yes," he said soberly, "and for the children's sake, who had no man nearer of blood or of kin than I to take their part. And for Erland's sake, since we were to be true brothers, one to the other. And now, don't lose your wits. I've seen more than enough of that in this house today." He flamed up and flung the shoe he had taken off against the wall. Ramborg went and picked it up, looked at the log where it had struck. "'Tis a shame that Torbjorg could not think of it herself, to wash the soot off here for the banquet. I forgot to tell her to do it." She wiped the shoe. It was Simon's best pair, with long toes and red heels, then took up the other and laid the pair in his clothes chest. But he saw that her hands shook sorely while she was doing it. On that he went and took her into his arms. She twined her slender limbs vehemently about her husband, while she shook with strangled weeping, and whispered on his bosom that she was so weary. 7 days later, Simon and his henchmen were riding north from Differen through Kvam. They struggled forward against a storm of great clinging snowflakes. Towards midday they came to the little farm by the highway, where there was a tavern. The woman came out and begged Simon to step into their house. Only small folk were sent to the rest house. She shook his wet outer garments and hung them to dry on the crossbeam by the hearth while she talked away. Such filthy weather. 'Twas pity for the horses, and he must have had to ride the whole way round, since there was no riding over Lake Majose now. "Oh, yes, if a man be sick of living." The woman and the children standing beside her laughed with a good will. The bigger ones made themselves errands into the room with firewood and beer. The little ones bunched themselves together away by the door. Often they got pennies from Master Simon of Formoe when he stopped there, and if he had with him something good for his children from Hamar market, they were like enough to get a taste. But today it seemed he had other things on his mind. He sat on the bench, bent forward, with his hands hanging out over his knees, staring into the hearth fire, and answering a word now and again to the woman's flood of talk. Then she let fall that Erland Nikolausen was at Granheim today. It was today that the Udal men were to pay the first of the redemption money to the ancestral owners. Should she send one of her children to his brother-in-law and tell him, so that they might ride home together? No, said Simon. She might give him a little food, and after that he would lie down and sleep a while. Erland he would meet soon enough. What he meant to say, he would say in Gaut's hearing, but he had rather not speak of the thing more than once. His man Sigurd had settled down in the kitchen house while the woman was cooking the food. Aye, it was a toilsome journey, and besides the master had been like an angry bull nearly the whole way. Simon Anderson was wont to hearken gladly enough to all the news of his home parish that his men could pick up when they had been at Differen. He had most often one or more Raumarik men eating his bread. Folk came and sought service with him when he was at Differen, for he was known to be a kindly man, open-handed and merry-hearted, and not wont to be too high and mighty with his men. But "Hold your tongue," was just about the softest answer he, Sigurd, had had of his master that journey. Moreover, it seemed he had quite fallen out with his brothers. He had not even slept overnight at Differen. They had taken lodging on a leasehold farm nearby in the parish. Sir Gerd, for she must know, the king had made his master's brother a knight at Yuletide. Sir Gerd had come out into the yard and prayed Simon, right fairly, to stay. Simon had scarce answered his brother, and they had roared and bellowed and shouted, these gentry in the high loft hall. Yonder Sir Ulf Saxon and Goodman Anderson had been at the manor, enough fairly to frighten folk. God only knew what they had fallen so by the ears about. Simon came past the kitchen-house door, stood a moment, and glared in. Sigurd said, quickly, he was getting an awl and a buckle to put the saddle gear to rights that was broken that morning. "Do they have things like that in the kitchen, on this farm?" Simon flung back at him, and went his way. Sigurd shook his head and nodded to the woman, when Simon was out of sight. Simon thrust the platter from him and sat on at the board. He was so weary he could scarce bring himself to rise. But after a while he went and threw himself upon the bed in his boots and spurs. But he thought him then it were a pity of the bed. It was clean and good for such a humble house. He sat up and pulled off his footgear. Stiff and weary as he was, he sure should be able to sleep now. And he was wet through and shivering with cold, though his face burned after the long ride against the storm. He crept in under the bedspread, turned and tossed about the pillows. They smelt so strangely of fish. Then he lay still, half raised upon his elbow. His thoughts began to go round again in a ring. He had thought and thought these days, as a beast tramps round on a tether rope. Even if Erling Vidkundsen had known it might cost Gerd and Gudmundar life and goods, if Erland Nikolausen let himself be driven to speak. Aye, that made it none the worse that he had gone all lengths to win the Bjarko knight's help. Rather the contrary. Surely a man owed it to his brothers to stand by them, to the death if need be. Yet he would love to know if indeed Erling had known it. Simon weighed the chances for and against. Quite without knowledge that a rising was a-brewing, he sure could not have been. He must have known. But what did Erling know? Gerd and Ulf, at least, seemed not to know if the man had knowledge that they were in it. But Simon remembered that Erling had named the Haftorsons, had counselled him to seek help there, for it was rather their friends who had need to be afraid. The Haftorsons were cousins of Ulf Saxon and Helga. The nose is near to the eyes. But even if Erling Vidkundsen had believed that Simon was thinking of his own brothers too, what he had done was none the worse, surely, for that. And Erling might well have seen, too, that he knew nothing of his brother's peril. Besides, had he not said himself? He remembered. He had said it to Stig. He didn't believe that they could get Erland to talk. Nevertheless, they might well have need to fear Erland's tongue. Having held his peace in despite of bonds and torture, He was the very man to betray himself after by a slip of the tongue. It would be just like him. And yet Simon felt that was the one thing he could be sure Erland would not do. He was as dumb as a stone each time the talk turned that way, for very fear he might be drawn on to say too much. Simon saw that such was Erland's fevered, well-nigh childish dread of breaking his troth, childish, for that himself had betrayed the whole enterprise to his paramour. Erland, it seemed clear, thought not such a stain on his honour as he need regard. Such a thing, he seemed to think, might happen to the best. So long as he held his tongue himself, he counted his shield untarnished and his troth unbroken. And Simon had seen well that Erland was tender of his honour, so far as he understood what good fame and honour were. Had he not gone clean beside himself with despair and wrath, at but the thought that any of his fellow plotters should be betrayed by the words of his child, spoken to him who was nearest of kin to these same men? And now, so long after, and in such a way that it was not possible it could matter anything to the men he had shielded with his life, and his honour and his wealth. He would order it so that, if things went wrong, he would pay the price for them all. This Erland had sworn upon the crucifix before all who joined him in this enterprise. But that grown men in their right minds could put their trust in such an oath, for it was clear the issue didn't rest with Erland. Now that he knew all about the plot, Simon thought it was the most witless folly he had ever heard. Erland had been willing to be torn limb from limb that he might keep the letter of his oath. And all the while the secret lay in a 10-year-old boy's hands. Erland had himself seen to that. Nor did it seem to be his fault either that Sigrid Undset knew no more than she knew. Could anyone make such a fellow out? So, if he had for a moment thought, what Erland and his wife suspected he had thought, God knows that thought lay close enough to hand when Gout came out with this tale of having seen his seal below the treasonous letter. And both of them might have remembered that Simon knew one thing and another of Erland Nicolausson that gave him less ground than most men to believe at all times the best of that man. But it was like they had forgotten long ago how once he had come upon them and seen into the depths of their shamelessness. So it was with little reason he lay there, ashamed as a beaten dog, for that he had done Erland wrong in his thoughts. God knew it was not that he gladly thought ill of his brother-in-law. Nothing but unhappiness had he felt at the thought. But he knew himself it was a witless, foolish misthought. He would have seen straight away, even without Kristin's words, that it could not be so. Well nigh as soon as the thought came to him, that Erland might have misused his seal, he had felt, no, Erland could never have done it. Never in his life had Erland done a dishonourable deed that had anything of forethought in it, or anything of sense. Simon flung himself about in the bed and groaned. They had driven him half crazy himself with all this foolishness. It hurt him so to think that Gout had gone for years believing this of him, and yet it was against reason to take it so badly. Even though he were fond of the boy, fond of all Kristin's sons, they were scarce more than children after all. Did he need to care so much what they thought of him? And why should such boiling wrath come on him, when he thought on the men who had laid their hands on Erland's sword hilt and sworn to follow their chieftain? If so be they were such sheep as to let themselves be dazzled by Erland's glib tongue and his hardihood, and to deem that man had the stuff of a chieftain in him, it was no more than was to be expected that they should behave like frightened sheep once the whole plan went wrong. He still felt giddy when he thought on what he had heard at Different just now. So many men had been willing to sell the peace of the land and their own welfare into Erland's hands. And Hafthor Olafsson and Borgar Tronsson. and not one had had the manfulness to step forth and crave of the king that Erland be granted an honourable atonement and safety for his Udal lands. They were so many that, had they stood together, it had been no hard matter to force their will through. It seemed that amongst the gentry of Norway there was less of man's wit and of manhood than he had thought. He was angry too that he himself had been altogether left out of these councils. Not that they could have got him to join with them in such a senseless plot, but because both Erland and Gerd had gone behind his back and kept him in the dark. Was he not every whit as much a noble as any of the rest? And did he not count more than a little in the countryside where folk knew him? In a fashion he admitted that Gerd was right. So as Erland had made a wreck of his leadership, the man could not crave, with reason, that his fellows in the plot should come forth and admit they had leagued with him. Simon knew that, had he found Gerd alone, he had not come to part from his brothers in this way. But there lay yonder Sir Ulf, with his long legs stretched out before him, discoursing on Erland's lack of wit. Now, after the fray. And then Gudmund chimed in. Neither Gerd nor Simon had ever before suffered their youngest brother to gainsay them in anything. But since he had wedded with the priest's leman, his own leman thereafter, the boy had grown so puffed up and self-glorious. As Simon sat there, he grew wild at the very sight of him. He prated so pertly, and his round red face looked so like a child's backside, that Simon's hands itched to smack it. In the end, he had scarce known himself what he said to the three men. So, now 'twas come to a breach between him and his brothers. He felt as though he must bleed to death when he thought on it, as though bonds of flesh and blood had been torn asunder. It had made him poor, bare his brotherless back. But whether it were so or so, in the midst of their angry broil he had understood of a sudden, he himself knew not how, that Gerd's numbed, half-hearted bearing came not alone from his sore need of a little peace at home. He had seen in a flash that Gerd loved Helga still, and it was this that made his brother seem so fettered and strengthless. And strangely, he didn't understand how this roused him to fury against the whole of life. Simon hid his face in his hands. Aye, this it was to have been good, dutiful sons. It had come easy to both Gerd and himself to feel love for the brides their father came and said he had chosen for them. The old man had spoken to them one evening right goodly words of counsel, so that at length they sat there, quite shamefaced, the two of them, of marriage and friendship and faith between honourable, clean-living wedded folk. And last of all, their father had even talked of prayer and intercession and masses. It was a pity their father had not given them counsel on how to forget as well. When friendship is shattered and honour dead, and faithfulness a sin and a secret, shameful torture, and the bond has left nothing behind it save a bleeding sore that never can be healed. After Erland was set free, a kind of peace had fallen upon him, if only because a man cannot go on suffering such pain as he had suffered that time in Oslo. Either something happens, or it gets better of itself. He had not been glad when Kristin had moved into Jorengard with her husband and all her children, and he had to meet them and keep up friendship with them and the dues of kin. But he comforted himself. It had been so much worse when he had to dwell with her, as a man cannot bear to live with the woman he loves if she is not his wife nor his blood kin. And what had befallen between Erland and himself that night they made festival for his brother-in-law's deliverance from prison, he made light of that. Erland, like enough, had not understood more than half, and it was probable he thought little on the matter. Erland had such a rare gift for forgetting. And he himself had his manner, and his wife, who was dear to him, and his children. Simon had found peace after a fashion. It was not his fault that he loved his wife's sister. She had been his betrothed maid once. It was not he who had broken his troth to her. When first he set his heart on Kristin Lavransdatter, it was but his duty, for then he thought she was to be his wife. That it was her sister he got, that was Ramborg's doing and her father's. Lavrans, a wise man though he was, had never thought to ask him whether Simon had forgotten. Although he did know, not even Lavrans would he have suffered to ask that. He was no good hand at forgetting. It was not his doing that it was so, and he had never said one word that should have been left unsaid. He could not help it if the devil tempted him with dreams and promptings that did wrong to the bond of blood. Of his own free will he had never given himself up to sinful thoughts of love. And in deeds he had been as a trusty brother to her and hers. That he knew himself. At length he had come to be content with his lot. So long as he knew it was he who had served those two yonder, Kristin and the man she had cast him off for. They had always been forced to take succour at his hands. Not any more. Kristin had staked her life and her soul's health to save his son's life. And it was as though all the old wounds had burst open since he had let this happen. And since then it had come to pass that he owed Erland his life. And then, in return, he had wronged him, not with his will, in his thoughts only, but yet. He knew he could always bring himself to forgive his debtors fairly enough. It seemed to him much harder to forgive one who has laid a load of debt upon his shoulders. And now that they could call themselves quits, he and those two, he felt every ancient grudge that he had trampled underfoot these many years sprout up and quicken. No longer could he thrust Erland aside in his thoughts for a witless babbler who could neither see, nor learn, nor think, nor remember. The other weighed now upon his spirit just because no one could know what Erland saw and thought and remembered. There was no counting on him. Many a man wins what is meant for another, but another's lot none may win. Aye, never a truer word had been spoken. He had loved his young bride. Had he got her, for sure he had been a well-contented man. Most like they had come to live well together. And she would have been still as she was when first they met, gentle and pure, shrewd, so that a man might take counsel of her even in greater matters. Something wilful in small things, but yielding in the main, used as she was when in her father's hands to let herself be led and helped and guarded. But then this man had got a hold on her, one not fit to guide himself, who had never guarded anything. He had ravaged her sweet maidenliness, broken her proud calm, torn asunder her woman's soul, and forced her to stretch to the uttermost all her powers. She had had to stand up for her lover, as a little bird guards its nest with throbbing body and shrilling cries when any draws near to its home. Her sweet, slender body had seemed to him made to be lifted aloft in a man's arms and shielded lovingly. He had seen it strained with wild resolve, while her heart beat within her with fear and courage and lust of battle, and she had fought for husband and children, even as a dove will grow fierce and fearless when she has young. Had it been he who was her husband? Had she lived 15 winters through in the shelter of his honest goodwill, full well he knew for him too she would have stood up if anything of mischance had come his way. With wisdom and firm will would she have stood by his side. But never would he have come to see the stony face she turned on him that night in Oslo, as she sat and told him she had been to that house and looked around within it. Never would he have heard her cry out his name in a voice of such wild despair and woe. And it was not the pure and honourable love of his youth that had answered in his heart. That wild craving that rose and cried out in answer to her wildness, never had he learned that anything such could harbour in his soul, had it gone with him and her as their fathers had planned. Her face, as she went past him out into the night to find help for his child. She had never dared to tread that road, had she not been Erland's wife, and long used to go on undaunted, even though her heart might shake with dread. The smile on her tear-stained face when she woke him and said the boy was calling for his father, so piercing sweet, can no one smile who doesn't know what it is to lose a fight and what it is to win it. It was Erland's wife he loved, as now he loved her. But then must his love be sin, and so there was no help for it. He must be unhappy, for he was so unhappy that at times he felt nothing but a great wonder that it was he who had come to this pass and could see no way out of his unhappiness. When, treading underfoot his own honour and all gentle breeding, he had reminded Erling Vidkundsen of things no man of honour would have whispered that he knew anything of, he had done it, not for brothers or kinsmen, but only for her. Only for her sake had he brought himself to beg of the other man, as the Lazars beg at church doors in the great towns, showing their loathsome sores. He had thought, some time she shall know of it. Not all, not how deeply he had abased himself, but when they both were come to be old folk, he had thought he would say to Kristin sometime, I helped you as best I might, for I remembered how dear I loved you that time you were my promised bride. One thing there was he dared not turn his thoughts to. Had Erland said anything to Kristin? He had thought some time she should hear it from his own mouth. I have never forgot that I loved you when we were young. But if so it were that she knew, and that it was from her husband she had learned it, no, then he thought he could bear no more. To her alone had he meant to say it, some time long since. When he thought on that hour when he himself had betrayed it, of Erland stumbling upon the thing he had thought hidden in his most secret heart. And Ramborg knew it, though how she had seen it he could not understand. His own wife and her husband, they knew it. Simon cried out, a wild choking cry, as he flung himself suddenly on his other side in the bed. God help him! It was his turn now to lie stripped naked, outraged, bleeding from torture wounds and quivering with shame. The woman pushed the door ajar. From the bed Simon's hot, dry, glittering eyes met hers. Did you not get to sleep? Erland Nikolausen rode by even now, with 2 others. Perhaps it was 2 of his sons that rode with him. Simon muttered some kind of answer, angry and meaningless. He would let them get well ahead. But else it would soon be time he too was thinking of that homeward road. As soon as he came into the hall and had taken off his outer gear, Andras would seize his fur cap and put it on his own head. While the boy sat astride the bench and rode to his uncle at Differen, the big cap would slip down, now upon the little nose and now back over his bonny bright locks. But it didn't help him much to think on such things. God knew when the boy was like to go a-visiting to his uncle at Differen now. But instead came the memory of that other son of his, Halfrid's child, Erling. It was not so often that he thought on him. A little ashy blue child body. The days that Erling lived, he had scarce seen him. he had had to sit by the dying mother. Had the child lived, or had it lived longer than its mother? Then had Manvik been his own. And then, like enough, he would have sought a new mate there in the south country. Only now and again would he have come to his estate here, north in the dale. And so, maybe, he would have not forgotten Kristin. She had led him too wondrous a dance for that ever to be. A man might sure have leave to remember as an adventure that he had been fain to fetch his bride, a high-born maid, bred up in chaste and Christian ways, home from a bordel and another man's bed. But then, maybe, he had not gone on so remembering her that it racked him, and took all relish, and whatever else of good life held for him. Erling. He would have been 14 winters old by now. When, in due time, Andres drew so near to man's estate, Simon himself would be old and laid aside. Oh, Alfred, you were not very happy with me. Maybe it is not so undeserved that things have gone with me as they have. And then, for sure, Erland Nikolausen would have had to pay for his folly with his life, and Kristin had been sitting now at Jorengard a widow. And he himself going about, maybe, rueing that he was a wedded man. There was nothing so witless but that he could believe it of himself now. The gale had died down, but big wet flakes of spring snow still fell as Simon rode from the tavern yard. And now, towards evening, the birds were beginning to pipe and trill in the woody thickets, in despite of the falling snow. As a cut in the skin bursts open again at a hasty movement, a chance memory gave him pain. Not many days ago, at his Easter feast, they, a whole troop of them, had stood outside basking in the midday sun. High above them, in a birch tree, sat a robin, piping out into the warm blue air. Gimund came round the house corner, limping, dragging himself along on his staff with one hand on his eldest son's shoulder. He looked up, stopped, and mimicked the bird. The boy, too, pursed his mouth and whistled. They could copy well-nigh every bird note. Kristin stood a little way off, with some of the other women. Her smile was so fair as she listened. Towards sunset the clouds thinned out in the west, rolled in golden drifts along the white fell-sides, filled glens and little dales with thick grey mist. The river had a dull gleam as of brass. It rushed and eddied, wide and dark, round the stones in its course, and on each stone lay a little white cushion of new-fallen snow. The weary horses made but slow going over the heavy roads. It was milk-white tonight, with a full moon peering out through driving haze and clouds, when Simon rode down the steep banks of the Ula. When he was come over the bridge and out upon the flat fir-tree heath where the road ran in winter, the horses made better speed. They knew they were nearing their stalls. Simon patted Diggerbine's wet, streaming neck. He was glad at any rate that this journey was near an end. Ramborg, perhaps, was asleep long ere now. Where the road makes a sharp turn to leave the woods, there stood a little house. He was right near it when he grew aware that some men on horseback had drawn rein before the door. He heard Erland's voice cry, "Then 'tis sure you will come the first day after Holy Day? I can tell my wife that?" Simon shouted a greeting. 'Twould seem too unusual not to stay and ride on in their company, but he bade Sigurd go on ahead. Then he rode up to the others. They were Nakvi and Gout. Erland came forth from the house door at the same moment. He greeted them again. The three gave back his greeting somewhat uneasily. He could see their faces but dimly in the glimmering light. It seemed to Simon they looked at him doubtfully, seemed at once curious and resentful. So he said straight out, "I come from different, brother-in-law." "I heard you had gone south." Erland stood with his hand on the saddle-bow, looking down. "You have ridden hard, would seem," he added, as if to break an irksome silence. "You too stay a little," Simon said to the youths as they made to ride on. "You too must listen to this. It was my brother's seal you saw on the letter, Gout, and I think it must seem to you that they kept their troth but ill with your father, he and the other knights who set their seals to the letter to Prince Haakon, your father was to bear to Denmark." The boys looked down in silence. Erland spoke. "One thing I think you did not know, Simon, when you rode to tryst with your brother. The safety I bought for Gerd and those others was dearly bought, with everything I owned, save the name of a trusty man that held to his word. Now Gerd Dar thinks for sure I can't even claim that." Simon bowed his head, abashed. Of that he hadn't thought. "Why didn't you say this to me, Erland, when I told you I would ride to Differen? Sure, you must have seen that I was so mad with rage when I rode from your manor, there was neither thought nor counsel in me. I was scarce in my full wits either, Erland. No, but I think you might have had time to think on yonder long road. Nor could I well have prayed you to give up your intent to question your brother, without betraying things I had sworn a dear oath to keep hidden." Simon said nothing for a while. At first it seemed to him the other was in the right of it. But then it struck him. Nay, now was Erland as wrong-headed as he could be. Should he have sat still and suffered Kristin and the boys to think such evil of him? He asked this angrily. "I have never breathed a word of this, kinsman, either to my mother or my brothers," said Gout, turning his comely bright face to Simon. "No, but none the less they learnt of it in the end," he answered stubbornly. "I think, after all that befell yonder day at my house, there was great need that we should clear the matter, and I don't see how it could come upon your father so unawares. Much more than a child you are not yet, my Gout, and you were young when you were made a sharer in these secret councils." "I know whether I can trust my own son," cried Erland hotly. "And I had no choice when I must save the letter. 'Twas either give it to Gout or let the warden find it." It seemed to Simon there was no use to speak more of the matter, but he could not refrain from saying, "I didn't like it when I learned what the boy had gone about believing of me these 4 years. I have ever set much by you, Gout." The boy urged his horse forward a few paces. He held out his hand, and Simon saw his face grow darker, as though he flushed. "You must forgive me, Simon." Simon gripped the boy's hand. At times, Gout's face could be so like his mother's father that it moved Simon strangely. He was something bow-legged and low of stature when afoot, but he was a rarely good rider, and on horseback he was as fair a sprig of young manhood as could gladden a father's eyes. Now they rode northwards, all four, the boys ahead. When they were out of earshot, Simon said, "You do understand, Erland, I think. You cannot rightly blame me for seeking out my brother and asking him to tell me the truth about this matter. But I realized you had cause for anger against me, you and Kristin. For as soon as these," he groped for words, "strange tidings came out, what Gout said of my seal, I cannot deny that I understand your believing that I thought what I should have had wit to know was unthinkable. So you have had good reason to be angry with me," he said again. The horses splashed through the snow slush. It was a little while until Erland answered, and then his voice sounded most meek and mild. I don't know, after all, what else you could have thought. Sure it was the easiest thing to think. No, I should have known. It was well nigh impossible. Simon broke in sorely. A little after he asked, "Did you think that I knew of this, of my brother? That it was for their sake I tried to help you?" "No," said Erland wonderingly. "I knew for sure that you could not know it. That I had said nothing, I knew. And that your brother had said nothing, that I thought I could be well sure of." He laughed a little. Then he grew grave. "I know well," he said softly. "You did it for our father-in-law's sake, and because you are a good man." Simon rode on for a time and said no word. "You were very angry, I think?" he asked in a little. "Oh, when I got time to think. I see not that there was any other meaning you could put on it." "And Kristin?" asked Simon, still lower. "Ah, she! You know well she would not have anyone point a finger at me, save herself. She thinks, I guess, she can see to that well enough herself. 'Tis the same with our children. God have mercy on me if I speak a word of blame to them. But trust me, I did set her right." "You did that?" "Yes. When time and season serve, I shall surely make her understand. You know well Kristin is such a one that when she has bethought her, she will remember you have shown us such trusty friendship that—" Simon felt his heart quiver with a tingling wrath. He felt it was more than he could bear. The other seemed to think that now they might cast this matter quite from their thoughts. His face, in the pale moonlight, showed utterly at peace. Simon's voice shook with the hurry of his spirits as he spoke again. "You must forgive me, Erland. I don't understand how I could believe—" "You hear," the other broke in a little impatiently, "that I understand. I think it has been hard for you to believe otherwise." "Would to God those witless young ones had never spoken," said Simon vehemently. "Yeah, gout has never had such a beating in his life before. And to think it all came of bickering over their far-off forebears, Ryder Birkebein and King's School and Bishop Nicholas." Erland shook his head. "But come, brother-in-law, think no more about it. It were best we forget all this as soon as we can." "I cannot." "No, Simon." This came by way of protest, gentle and wondering. "It's not worth taking it so badly." "I cannot, do you hear? I am not so good a man as you." Erland looked at him in amazement. "Now, I don't know what you mean." "I am not so good a man as you. I cannot forgive so easily them I have wronged." "I don't know what you mean," said the other as before. "I mean—" Simon's face was drawn and marred with pain and passion. He spoke low, as though he crushed down a longing to cry aloud. "I mean, I have heard you speak fair words of Sigurd the Lagmand at Steigen, the old man whose wife you stole from him. I have seen and known that you loved Lavrans with a son's love, and never have I marked that you bore me a grudge, for that you lured from me my promised maid. I am not so high-minded as you think, Erland. I am not so high-minded as you. I bear a grudge to the man I have wronged." His cheeks palely flecked with passion, he stared into the other's eyes. Erland had listened to him with mouth half open. "I have never dreamed about this till now. Do you hate me, Simon?" he whispered, astounded. "Doesn't it seem to you that I have cause to hate you?" Without knowing it, both men had stayed their horses. They sat gazing into each other's faces. Simon's little eyes glittered like steel. In the hazy white light of the night, he saw that Erland's thin features worked, as though something stirred within him, an awakening. He looked up from under half-closed eyelids, biting his quivering underlip. "I cannot bear to meet you any more." "Man, it's 20 years ago!" Erland burst out in amazement. "Yes. Don't you think that she is worth remembering for 20 years? Erland drew himself upright in his saddle. He met Simon's gaze full and steadfastly. The moonlight kindled a blue-green spark within his great light eyes. "Yes, God bless her." So he sat for a moment. Then he set spurs to his horse and dashed forward along the miry track, splashing the water high behind him. Simon held Diggerbine back. He was well nigh thrown, so suddenly did he rein in the horse. He tarried there on the edge of the woods, struggling with the impatient beast, for as long as he could hear the hoof-strokes in the slush. Remorse had rushed over him in the moment he had said it. Remorse and shame, as though he had struck the most defenceless of creatures, a child or a fine and gentle, reasonless beast, in senseless wrath. His hate seemed like a shivered lance. He himself seemed shivered by the clash with this man's witless simplicity. So little understanding had this bird of ill omen, Erland Nicolausen, it was as though he must be held both helpless and innocent. He cursed and swore under his breath as he rode on. Innocent. The fellow was long past 20 years. 'Twas high time he learnt to suffer being spoken to man. If Simon had wounded himself, ay, devil take him if it was not a cheap price to pay, if he had but got one blow home on Erland for once. Now he was riding home to her. God bless her, he mocked wryly. And then there would be an end to all this struggling for brotherly love, betwixt those two there and him and his. He need never more meet with Kristin Lavransdatter. The thought took away his breath. Yet, devil take it, why not? If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out, said the priests. 'Twas for this, mostly, he told himself, that he had done this thing. To escape this make-believe of brother and sister's love with Kristin. He could bear it no more. Only one wish he had now, that Ramborg might not wake when he came home. But when he rode down between the fences, he saw a dark form in a cloak standing under the aspen trees. Her head linen showed white. She had been waiting there, she said, ever since Sigurd came home. The serving women were abed, and Ramborg herself ladled out the porridge from the pot which stood against the fire to keep warm, set bacon and bread on the board, and fetched fresh-drawn ale. "Will you not go to bed now, Ramborg?" asked the man, while he ate. Ramborg didn't answer. She went over to her loom and began to thread the little many-coloured balls in and out of the warp. She had set up a tapestry before Yule, but she was not come very far with it yet. "Erland rode northwards a while ago," she said, as she stood with her back to him. "I thought, from what Sigurd said, you were coming with him." "No, it fell not out that way." "Erland longed more for home and bed than you?" She laughed a little. As she got no answer, she said again, "He, I think, ever longs to come home to Kristin when he has had an errand from home." Simon kept silent for a good while before he answered. Erland and I did not part as friends. Ramborg turned sharp around. He told her then what he had heard at Differen, and of the first part of his talk with Erland and his sons. "I think 'tis scarce reason to fall at odds over this, when you have been able to keep friends until now." "Maybe, yet so it fell out. But it were too long to tell the whole story tonight." Ramborg turned to her loom and busied herself with the work again. "Simon," she asked all at once, "do you remember a saga Sire Eirik read to us once upon a time, out of the Bible, of a young maid named Abishag the Shunammite?" "No." "About the time King David grew old, and his strength and manhood began to fail," began the wife. But Simon broke in. "My Ramborg, the night is too far spent. 'Tis no time to begin telling sagas now. And I remember too now how it was with her you just named." Ramborg beat the weft up with the reed. She held her peace for a little. Then she spoke again. "Do you remember then that saga that my father could tell? Of Tristan the comely, and Isolde the fair, and Isolde the dark?" "Ah, yes, that one I do remember." Simon pushed the dish from him, rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth, and stood up. He came over to the fireplace. With one foot up on the edge, elbow on knee, and chin in hand, he stood looking into the fire that was burning itself out in the stone-built cavern. From the corner by the loom came Ramborg's voice, quavering and ready to break. "I thought always, when I heard those sagas, that such men as King David and Sir Tristan, it seemed foolish and cruel that they didn't love the young brides who brought them their maidenhood and their heart's love in all gentleness and seemly purity, more than such like woman as the Lady Bathsheba, or yonder Isolde the Fair, who had made waste of themselves in other men's arms. I thought, had I been a man, I had not been so prideless, or so heartless." She stopped, overcome. "I thought it was the hardest of fates, the lot they had, Abishag and that poor Isolde of Bretland." She turned vehemently, came across the room and stood before her husband. "What ails you, Ramborg?" Simon spoke low and with an ill grace. "I don't know what you mean by all this." "Yes, you know," she said vehemently. "You yourself are like yonder Tristan." "That can I scarce believe." He tried to laugh. "That I am like Tristan the Fair. And the two women you named, if I remember aright, they lived and died spotless maids, untouched of their husbands." He looked over at his wife. Her little three-cornered face was white, and she bit her lips. Simon put his foot to the ground, stood upright, and laid both hands upon her shoulders. "My Ramborg, have we not had 2 children, you and I?" he said softly. She answered not. "I have striven to show you I was thankful to you for that gift. I thought myself, I have tried to be a good husband to you." She still said nothing, and letting fall his hands, he went and sat down upon the bench. Ramborg followed, stood before him looking down upon her husband. The broad thighs in wet muddied breeches, the unwieldy body, the heavy red-brown face. She pursed up her lips in distaste. Ill-favoured, too, have you grown with the years, Simon? Ah, yes. I never thought myself a comely man, he said soberly. And am I not young and fair? She sat on his lap. The tears started from her eyes as she clasped his head in both her hands. Simon, look at me. Wherefore can you not repay me for this? Never have I wished that any should have me save you. I thought even from the time I was a little maid, my husband should be such an one as you were. Do you remember how you led us both by the hand, Ulfhild and me? You were to go with father to the west paddock to look upon his foals. You bore her over the beck, and father would have taken me up, but I screamed out that you must bear me too. Do you remember? Simon nodded. He remembered well. He had been much taken up with Ulfhild. The lovely crippled child had seemed to him so pitiful. Of the youngest he had had no memory, save that there was one younger than Ulfhild. You had the goodliest hair. She ran her fingers through the thick-waved, light-browned forelock that hung somewhat down over her husband's brow. Not one grey hair have you yet in your head. Erlend's hair will soon be as much white as black. And I liked so well that there came those deep dimples in your cheeks when you smiled, and that you were so merry of speech. Ah, yes, like enough I was something better favoured then than I am now. No, she whispered vehemently, not when you look kindly on me. Do you remember the first time I slept in your arms? I was lying in bed crying with the toothache. Father and mother had gone asleep. It was dark in the loft room, but you came over to the bench where we lay, Ulfhild and I, and asked why I wept. You bade me to be quiet and not wake the others, and then you took me up into your arms. And then you lit the taper and cut a splint, and pricked around the bad tooth till the blood came. Then you said a blessing over the splint, and then I was soon well again, and I got leave to sleep in your bed, and you held me in your arm. Simon laid his hand upon her head and pressed it into his shoulder. Now that she spoke of it, he did remember. It was that time he was at Jorengard, and had told Lavrans that the bond between him and Kristin had best be loosed again. He had slept little that night. And now he remembered that he had got up once and done somewhat to help little Ramborg, who lay whimpering with the toothache. Have I behaved to you at any time, my Ramborg, that you think you have a right to say I don't love you? Simon, doesn't it seem to you that I deserve you should love me more than Kristin? Wicked and false she was to you. I have followed you about like a little lapdog all these years. Simon lifted her gently down from his lap, stood up, and took her hands in his. Don't speak that way of your sister any more, Ramborg. Not in that way. I wonder if you understand yourself what you say. Don't you think that I fear God? Can you believe of me that I could be so dreadless of shame and the worst of sins, or that I do not remember my children and all my kin and friends? I am your husband, Ramborg. Don't forget it, and don't speak that way to me. I know you have not broken God's law, or cast away faith and honour. Never have I spoken one word to your sister or touched her with my hand in any way that I can answer for on the judgment day. God and St. Simon the Apostle are my witnesses." Ramborg nodded silently. "Do you think your sister would have met me as she has done all these years if she thought as you do, that I loved her with sinful lust?" "No. Then you don't know Kristin." "No. She has never any thought whether any other man, save Erland, bears love for her. It scarce comes into her mind that we others are flesh and blood." "Ah, yes. Perhaps you do speak truly there, Ramborg," said Simon calmly. "But then you can sure understand for yourself how witless it is for you to plague me with jealousy." Ramborg drew away her hands. "I didn't mean it that way, Simon. But never have you cared for me as you cared for her. She is forever in your thought, even now. Of me you think hardly at all, unless I'm standing right in front of you." "'Tis not my doing, Ramborg, that a man's heart is so made, that what is writ thereon when it is young and fresh stands more deeply graven than all the runes cut afterwards." "Have you never heard the word that says, 'A man's heart is the first thing that quickens in his mother's womb, and the last thing in him to die?'" said Ramborg softly. "No. Is there a word that says the like? And it may well be true, too." He stroked her white cheek lightly. "But if we are to sleep tonight, we must go to bed now," he said wearily. Ramborg slept after a while, and Simon stole his hand from under her neck, moved gently towards the outer bed edge, and drew the fur coverlid right up under his chin. His shirt at the shoulder was wet through with her tears. He was bitterly heart-sore for his wife, and he understood too, with a new desperation, that he could no longer make shift to live with her by taking her as though she were a blind, unlessoned child. Now must he make up his mind that Ramborg was a grown woman. The window pane was grey already with dawn. The May night was near its end. He was deathly weary, and tomorrow was Mass day. Go to church tomorrow he would not, though sure enough he had great need of it. He had promised Lavrans once, never would he miss a Mass without full good cause. But, he thought bitterly, it had not helped him overmuch that he had kept his word all these years. Tomorrow he would not ride to Mass.